The storm had rolled in quiet but hard, covering the streets of Townsend, Montana, with a thick, blinding hush. You could barely see the pine trees at the edge of the town line. It was the kind of cold that didn't bite, it settled. On roofs, on shoulders, and inside the bones. Officer Paul Whitaker was used to these mornings. He'd moved up from the dry heat of New Mexico just 3 winters ago and still hadn't gotten used to the way the silence swallowed everything. On his 3rd round past the old grain silos, something unusual caught his eye. An elderly woman was crossing the snowy road slowly, deliberately wrapped in layers of wool and denim that looked older than she was. She walked hunched forward, her boots too light for the weather, her breath fogging up in short bursts. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Paul's attention. It was what she was holding. She carried it close to her chest, like a newborn covered in a patchy brown blanket. The shape was small, but not small enough to be a baby. It shifted every few steps. Twitching. Breathing. Whatever it was alive. He slowed the cruiser and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, you okay out here?" The woman stopped, not startled, just tired. She lifted her face, red-cheeked and wind-worn. "He's cold," she said simply. "He needs help." Paul stepped out, their boots crunching in the snow. "Mind if I take a look?" The woman hesitated, clutching the bundle tighter. Then gently, she peeled back the corner of the blanket. 2 eyes blinked up at him, wide amber and wild. A tiny face dappled in cream and soft brown, paws with faint black markings. Small pointed ears, one twitching slightly. A bobcat, a baby one. No bigger than a loaf of bread, and clearly not well. Paul blinked. He wasn't sure what stunned him more, the fact that she had a wild animal tucked against her chest, or that she was out here in a snowstorm with it like it was the most natural thing in the world. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I don't mean to alarm you, but that's not a kitten." She nodded once. "I know." That was the first time he met Eleanor Price. The baby bobcat's name, she told him, was Tinker. She'd named him just an hour ago, after finding him curled in the corner of her tool shed, barely breathing, his paw caught under a plank of rotted wood. "He didn't even try to run," she said softly. "Just looked at me like he was waiting." Eleanor was 71, retired librarian, widowed. Lived in the small, weather-beaten house at the end of Riverbend Lane, the one folks always said had too many wind chimes and not enough company. "I was headed to the vet," she explained. "Didn't want to call. Figured they'd just tell me what I already knew." Paul looked at the animal again. The bobcat's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms. Its fur was damp, spiked with flecks of blood near its hind leg. It wasn't a pet, but it was helpless. And Eleanor, she wasn't panicking. She wasn't scared. She was something else entirely, calm, like she'd done this before. Later, Paul would learn she had. Not with bobcats, but with injured birds, rabbits, even a fox kit once. She'd grown up with a father who believed any living thing that crosses your path with a limp is your responsibility now. She never forgot that. What struck Paul most wasn't just the act, it was how gentle she was. Not the type of gentleness that came from fragility, the kind that comes from having had your heart broken once and still choosing to keep it open. They sat together on the sidewalk's edge for a minute, snow collecting in silence. Paul radioed ahead to Dr. T. Mendez, the town's local vet, and then helped Eleanor into the cruiser. She let him take the bobcat from her arms only when they reached the front seat. "Be careful," she said. "He flinches if you touch his left side." She had already figured that out. As they pulled away, Paul glanced in the rearview mirror. Eleanor was watching Tinker's chest rise and fall, not with fear, but with something deeper, hope maybe, or need. Animals have a strange way of showing up when we need reminding that we still matter. For Eleanor, this wasn't just a rescue. It was a conversation she didn't know she needed. A reminder that even when the world gets small and your days get quiet, you can still be someone's lifeline. Even if that someone has claws and wild eyes. People sometimes ask why anyone would risk helping a wild animal. Why not leave it to nature? But Eleanor didn't see wild. She saw injured. She saw life fragile. and flickering, and she couldn't walk past it. Not when she still had breath in her body. That's the thing about stories like this, about animal rescue, emotional videos, wild cat babies, and their human companions. It's never just about the animal. It's about what we're willing to carry in our arms when no one's looking. What we're willing to believe is still worth saving. Later, Tinker would become a bit of a local legend. But at that moment in the back of a police cruiser under a pile of mismatched blankets, he was just another creature trying to survive the cold. Paul glanced back again. "We'll get him looked at," he said, unsure who he was reassuring more, her or himself. Eleanor simply nodded. "He's got spirit," she whispered. "You can feel it." The next few hours would unfold with paperwork, raised eyebrows, and a lot of questions from the local authorities. But for now, there was only the quiet hum of the cruiser, the soft sound of breathing from the back seat, and the slow turn of the wheels through snow. And one small paw poking out from the blanket, resting lightly on Eleanor's wrist, like it had been there all along. Sometimes the most unexpected moments leave the deepest prints. Sometimes healing begins in the simplest acts, like picking up something trembling from the snow and deciding not to let go. And sometimes it takes a baby bobcat to change the story. A town tells about an old woman, but Eleanor's story was just beginning. Because what started with kindness would soon lead to something much more complicated, something that would pit her compassion against the law and stir up memories this town had tried to bury. By the time Officer Paul pulled into the veterinary clinic on Alder Creek Road, the wind had picked up. The sky was the color of tin, and a sharp gust rushed through the lot as Eleanor stepped carefully from the cruiser, still holding Tinker with both hands. Inside the clinic was warm and quiet. The smell of antiseptic fur and cedar wood filled the air. Dr. Clarissa Mendez was already waiting in the exam room, glancing up from her clipboard with a look that said, "I wasn't expecting this." Paul introduced Eleanor softly and gave a quick run-through of the events. Clarissa, to her credit, didn't waste time on questions. She took the bobcat with professional care, gently setting him on a fleece-covered table. Tinker let out a low mewl, not a growl, but a sound of confusion. Clarissa examined his limbs, checked his breathing, scanned for fractures. The leg had swelling and one paw was definitely injured, possibly crushed, but the cub was alive and alert. "He's tougher than he looks," she murmured. Eleanor nodded. "Most things are." While Clarissa worked, Paul stepped outside to make the mandatory call to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, FWP. It was standard procedure. Wild animal involved human contact state law. But as he waited on hold, watching Eleanor through the clinic window, her hand resting on the edge of the table as Tinker blinked up at her, he felt a heaviness settle in his chest. The call, when it connected, was short and clinical. "Officer, you said a bobcat kitten rescued by a private citizen." "No, she doesn't hold a rehabilitation permit." "Then yes, she's in violation of state code. Section 875201. It is unlawful for an individual to harbor, transport, or treat wild game animals without authorization. The bobcat must be surrendered to an approved facility. No exceptions. When Paul relayed the message inside, Clarissa froze mid-scan. Eleanor just exhaled. "I figured." Paul watched her reaction carefully. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just nodded slowly, looking down at Tinker like someone about to say goodbye. "Do they know he was dying when I found him?" she asked. "Do they care that I was the only one there?" Paul didn't have an answer for that. Wildlife laws exist for a reason. They protect endangered species, prevent exploitation, and ensure that wild animals stay wild. But they're also rigid, designed more for clarity than compassion. And, in cases like this, gray areas where the heart acts faster than the law. The system has very little room to breathe. Dr. Clarissa quietly offered to keep Tinker overnight for observation. She'd report the case to the FWP herself in the morning, giving everyone a little time. Eleanor agreed. As she set the cub down on the soft blanket in the recovery crate, she leaned close and whispered something Paul didn't catch. But Tinker went still, like he was listening. As they left the clinic, Eleanor asked Paul a question that stayed with him. What would have happened if I hadn't picked him up? He paused. He'd probably have died in your shed. She nodded. Then I'll take the fine. But I won't regret it. At the diner later that night, over a cup of too-bitter coffee, Paul pulled out his phone and began searching wildlife rehabilitation protocols. He found lists of registered caregivers, the fine print of permits and requirements most citizens never knew existed. The system wasn't built to accommodate people like Eleanor, people with no credentials, just kindness. He read stories of similar situations in Colorado. A boy was fined $700 for trying to help an injured fawn. In Oregon, a woman was charged with a misdemeanor after nursing a baby squirrel. In both cases, the animals were seized. In neither case were the rescuers shown any gratitude. The line between rescue and violation was paper-thin. Paul sat there wondering what would have happened if Eleanor had lied. If she'd said she found the cub on the road and called authorities right away. Or if she'd said nothing at all, left the animal to freeze. Would the law have been satisfied then? There's a saying in small towns, you do what's right, not what's written, but that only works until someone from the state shows up with a clipboard. The next morning, Paul returned to the clinic just after 9 a.m. Clarissa greeted him with a grim smile. He made it through the night, she said. He's stronger already. But the FWP agent was on their way. Eleanor arrived minutes later, dressed in the same coat, but with her hair tied neatly and a notebook clutched under her arm. I brought the records, she said. When he ate, how often he urinated, body temperature. I know it doesn't matter, but it should. Clarissa placed the cub on the exam table again, this time without comment. Tinker stood for the first time wobbly but alert. His ears perked slightly when he heard Eleanor's voice. When the state officer arrived, a tall, sharp-jawed woman named Dana Reeves. There was no cruelty in her face, only procedure. She listened to Eleanor's story, reviewed the records, and took photos of the animal. It's clear you acted with good intentions, she said evenly, but that doesn't override the law. Paul wanted to interject. Then, what does Eleanor asked only one question. Where will he go to a licensed wildlife rehab facility outside Helena? He'll be assessed for re-release, Dana replied. And if he can't go back to the wild, Dana hesitated. Then, possibly to a sanctuary. Possibly euthanasia if his injuries are severe. Clarissa bristled. He's healing. He's not critical. Dana looked between them. My hands are tied. In the end, they let Eleanor carry him out. One last time. She wrapped him, gently pressed her cheek to his head, and whispered something again. When the state vehicle pulled away, she stood very still in the parking lot, watching the taillights disappear into the snowy road. Paul stayed beside her, silent. Finally, she spoke. I know the law says I was wrong, but I also know what it felt like to matter again. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Later that night, he sat in his cruiser radio, silent, and thought about the thousands of people who loved animals, really loved them, but were afraid to act because of what the law might do. How many baby bobcats were left in the snow because someone feared a fine? The lesson wasn't simple. It wasn't about changing the law or breaking it. It was about asking a better question. When does compassion deserve protection too? That's when Paul decided to write the letter. It wasn't long, just one page. A personal request to the Montana FWP advocating for Eleanor to be evaluated as a wildlife caregiver under supervised terms. He included a character reference, attached Dr. Mendez's report, and left his badge number at the bottom. It wasn't policy. It was a plea. But sometimes those go farther than protocol. Because what happened next? That changed everything. The next morning, just after the snowplows had cleared the main road, Officer Paul Whitaker stood at the kitchen counter in his small cabin outside of Townsend, staring down at his coffee. It had gone cold. His thoughts hadn't left Eleanor or the little bobcat since the moment he dropped her off the night before. He'd seen a lot in his years, accidents, injuries, even cruelty, but there was something about that woman's calm, the way she held that trembling bundle that lingered longer than usual. It wasn't just a rescue. It had felt like something more. Still, rules were rules. Montana has strict wildlife rehabilitation laws. They exist to protect native species from disease mishandling, even well-intentioned harm. Under State Code 875-201, harboring or attempting to care for a wild animal, especially a bobcat considered a protected species without proper licensing, is illegal. The law is clear contact and authorized rescue. Do not interfere. Do not take it home. But what about when it's lying in your shed barely breathing? What if no one else will come? That was the part the law didn't cover, the part where the line between compassion and crime gets blurred. Paul knew he had to report the incident, so that morning he called the Regional Wildlife Office and gave a full account. They listened carefully. Then came the response he expected but still didn't want to hear. "We'll need the animal transferred immediately. She's not certified. It's a Class B violation, even though she saved its life." There was a pause on the line. Intent doesn't change the code. Paul wrote the file number down. Then he closed the notebook and sat in silence. At 10:00 a.m., he knocked on Eleanor's door. She opened it with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I figured they'd send you back." Inside, the house smelled of pine and old books. A kettle steamed on the stove. Tinker was curled on a soft towel near the fireplace, his breathing steady but shallow. One paw twitched now and then. His spotted coat looked cleaner brushed. Eleanor had cleaned a small scratch above his eye. Paul sat across from her hat in his hands. "They want him transferred. Today." She nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "Where to, Helena? Wildlife rehab. They'll determine if he can be released eventually. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence. "I know how this goes," she said. "They'll do what's best for him." "But you know what's strange?" Officer Paul looked up. "No one ever asked why I did it, only if I was allowed to." That stuck with him. For Eleanor, it hadn't been a decision. It had been a reflex. You find something small in pain and you don't walk away. You wrap it in your coat. You speak gently. You hope that helps. She looked at the fire, not at him. "I've done things wrong in my life, but this wasn't one of them." Paul didn't argue. He didn't need to. He'd seen the way Tinker responded to her voice, the slow way his breathing calmed when she was near. Animals, especially wild ones, don't fake trust. He pulled a form from his coat. "They're not pressing charges, just issuing a warning. But we have to follow the process." Eleanor signed it without flinching. Then after a quiet pause, she rose and gently lifted the bobcat into the same blanket she'd used the night before. "He likes this one," she said. "Smells like cedar." Paul carried the box to the cruiser while Eleanor followed with slow, steady steps. Before getting in, she paused, looked toward the hills behind her home. "You know, I used to think I had nothing left to offer. But last night, he looked at me like I still mattered." The ride to Helena was quiet. Tinker slept for most of it, chest rising and falling. Eleanor kept her hand near the crate the whole way. At the rehabilitation center, a young woman in a gray vest met them with clipboards and a practiced smile. She checked the crate, jotted down notes, asked Paul about the animal's condition. Then she turned to Eleanor. "Thank you for bringing him in. We'll take it from here." Eleanor nodded but didn't let go just yet. She crouched by the crate and whispered something Paul couldn't hear what. Then she touched the side of the box one last time and walked back to the cruiser without a word. On the drive home, Paul found himself watching her in the mirror again. She didn't cry, she didn't talk, but she did something more telling. She rested her hand flat on her knee like it had nowhere else to go now. That night, Paul opened his laptop and began writing a letter. It wasn't official, not part of any report. Just a message to the Montana Wildlife Department requesting a special review of Eleanor's case. He explained what she had done, not just the rescue, but the care, the documentation, the willingness to comply. "She's not reckless," he wrote. "She's responsible. She acted when others wouldn't. That matters." He asked them to consider allowing her to volunteer under supervision, to keep some small connection to the world she clearly understood better than most. He didn't know if they'd respond, but he knew he had to try. What happened with Eleanor wasn't unique. All across the country, people stumble upon hurt animals, foxes, owls, raccoons, wild cat babies, and act out of instinct. But they don't know the law, or they do and they still choose kindness, and often they get punished for it. Fair use laws protect commentary, criticism, and education. But what protects the person who simply couldn't walk past a creature in pain? That's the heart of this question. Maybe love isn't enough to override the rules, but maybe the rules need to remember what love looks like. There's something healing in watching animal rescue stories, something quietly powerful in the way people risk comfort, warmth, or even legal trouble just to help something that can't speak. It's not just a cute animal video, it's a reminder we still care. In the coming days, Eleanor's story would ripple further than she expected. But at that moment alone in her house, with an empty towel and a fire that burned too quietly, she just sat. And Paul, sitting in his cruiser, stared up at the stars that peeked through Montana's heavy sky. Somewhere out there, Tinker was sleeping in a clean pen under veterinary care. And somewhere inside both of them, a small warmth remained. A wildlife had touched a human one, and neither would be quite the same again. Next. When healing begins with silence and a stranger begins to listen. 3 days after Eleanor surrendered Tinker the vet at Helena Wildlife Rehabilitation called Officer Paul Whitaker directly. Her voice was soft but direct. The cub's in more trouble than we thought. At first glance, Tinker had looked stable underweight, slightly dehydrated and with a limp that suggested a sprain or bruised paw. But beneath that quiet tremble, his little body had been hiding a far more dangerous injury. Internal bruising along the left flank. Possible organ trauma. The kind of damage that doesn't show up in the first few hours or even the first day. He must have been crushed under something, the vet explained. Probably a falling branch or part of a rotted structure. It's a miracle he made it long enough to be found. Paul didn't answer right away. He thought back to Eleanor's shed, the way she had described seeing him there curled in a corner under her father's old workbench. The roof above had sagged. The beams had bent in the snow. It made sense now. He hadn't been abandoned. He'd been trapped. The vet continued. We're treating it. Pain management, fluid support. But he's young, and wild animals under stress sometimes stop fighting. They just give up. Paul sat back in his chair. Outside his office window, the snow was starting to melt into slush. The town looked different without a white coat, less forgiving. He asked the vet, has he responded to anyone? A pause. Not until yesterday. One of the volunteers brought in the blanket he came in with. The cedar-smelling one. He curled into it immediately. First time he slept more than 2 hours. Paul nodded. That blanket was hers. I figured. When the call ended, Paul didn't file a report. He just sat there thinking about what happens when the body hides damage the eyes can't see. Not just in animals, in people too. The next day, Paul drove to Eleanor's house without calling ahead. She was in the garden behind her porch, not gardening, just standing. The snow had melted in patches, revealing earth that had been sleeping for months. Her gloves were still on, though there was nothing in her hands. When she saw him, she didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. Just looked up and asked, "Is he worse?" Paul nodded. "He's fighting, but it's deeper than we thought." Eleanor didn't ask what would happen next. She only asked, "Is he alone?" They have other animals in recovery, but he's not with them. He's separate, too young to integrate yet. They're doing their best. She looked down at her gloves. Some animals, they don't fight when they're alone. They freeze. Paul waited. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "That's what happened to my brother. When we were kids." She didn't mean a literal freeze. She meant emotionally. Quiet boy, broken home, left school early, never got the help he needed. He stopped trying when no one stayed long enough to show him he mattered, she said. Paul didn't speak. There was nothing to say. That was the first time he realized why she'd stepped into that shed, why she hadn't walked away. Tinker hadn't been the only one freezing. When Paul returned to the office, he emailed the rehab center, requested updates, asked for details. That same night, he drove 2 hours to Helena and left the cedar blanket Eleanor had given him at the front desk. She said he liked this. 3 days later, they told him Tinker's appetite had returned. He was standing longer, vocalizing when handlers approached, and sleeping again. The good kind of sleep tucked into the corner of the fleece paws, twitching like he was dreaming of something warmer than Montana winter. Animals, even wild ones, form bonds. They don't look like ours. They don't last the same way, but they are real. Anyone who's ever watched a baby bobcat curl into a piece of fabric just because it smells like kindness knows that. That bond was still working. Even if Eleanor was no longer in the room, Paul asked for photos, not for press, not for the file, just for Eleanor. She didn't own a smartphone. He printed 2 pictures and brought them to her in a plain envelope. She held the first one for a long time, Tinker lying on his side, eyes closed, one paw stretched across the blanket. "He's not curled into himself," she said quietly. "That's good." She didn't cry. She just closed the envelope and placed it in a box on the mantel next to a small framed photo of a man in overalls and a Forest Service badge. "That was my dad," she told him. "He used to say that helping an animal teaches you how to stay. Because they don't rush healing. They don't pretend to be fine. They just keep breathing. Or they don't. And if you're there long enough, they learn you're real." Paul left that day without needing to say much. Back at the rehab center, Tinker passed a new milestone. He began eating without assistance. His limp began to fade. And his body, though still fragile, showed signs of regaining balance. The vet described it plainly. "He wants to live now." That phrase stuck with Paul more than anything else. Because it wasn't just about bones and blood and vitals. It was about will, about choosing to stay alive. And that choice is never automatic, not for a wounded wildcat, and not for the people who carry them through the snow. There's a hidden battle we often don't see. Not in the wounds we treat, but in the ones that aren't visible on X-rays. The ones that whisper, "It's easier to give up," and those are the ones only presence can reach. Eleanor, in her own quiet way, had helped a creature make a different decision. And maybe without realizing had reminded herself of that possibility too. For those watching this story unfold, it's easy to see a cute animal video and stop there. A wild cat baby wrapped in a blanket, a kind woman, a snowy road. It makes for a beautiful frame. But the real story happens after the picture fades, when the rescue becomes a relationship, when the effort becomes a daily, ordinary miracle. It's what happens when someone chooses to care not once but again and again, even when they're told not to. And sometimes those are the stories that save us back. As the weeks passed, Tinker began preparing for transfer to a larger wildlife preserve. His injuries were healing well, and the vets believed he'd be strong enough to eventually return to the wild. But they noted one strange behavior. Every time someone walked past his pen holding a cedar-scented cloth, he'd stop, sniff the air, and press his nose against the gate. "Still looking for her?" Paul said softly when he visited. The vet nodded. Sometimes healing isn't about returning to what was. It's about remembering who helped you become something new. Tinker was on that path now. And Eleanor. She had no idea what the state office was quietly reviewing, what Paul had written, what Clarissa had added, what a wildlife rehab volunteer had submitted unprompted. But that would come soon. For now, she sat by her fire, every evening sometimes, with her fingers resting on the folded blanket she'd kept a piece of. Not as a souvenir, but as a reminder. Of a moment, of a bond, of a life that didn't give up. The day the letter arrived, Eleanor didn't open it right away. It had the state seal on the corner, that familiar official crispness. She placed it gently on the table beside her tea and stared at the fire for a long time. She already knew who had written it, and she had a feeling about what it meant. But knowing and opening are two different things. 3 weeks had passed since she last saw Tinker. Word had trickled back through quiet channels. Dr. Mendez stopped by with a smile and a nod. A local wildlife volunteer had dropped off a note. He's getting stronger. Eating on his own now. No signature, just a drawing of a paw print and a sprig of cedar. But the letter this was official. This was different. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Paul Whitaker sat in his cruiser outside the elementary school, sipping coffee gone lukewarm again. It had become a habit lately, driving the same loop, checking the same fences, watching the same old corners. But something had shifted in him. Not because of one bobcat, but because of what that rescue had shown him about the space between doing your job and doing the right thing. The day he'd sent the letter to the Montana Wildlife Board, he hadn't expected much. He wasn't a lawyer. He didn't cite codes or precedents. He just told the truth. That a woman had found a wildcat baby near death. That she'd stayed. That she'd done everything with care, with documentation, with calm. That she had no interest in breaking laws, only in honoring life. He'd written about the blanket, about the healing, about how the animal calmed at the sound of her voice, about how some things don't fit inside regulations but matter anyway. And then he waited. But what he didn't expect, what caught him by surprise, was how the town began to respond. It started with Lucille, who ran the bakery. She'd refused to speak to Eleanor since the fire that killed Eleanor's father decades ago. The old suspicions had never quite left her, but that week she began leaving a warm cinnamon loaf on Eleanor's porch. No note, just a quiet shift. Then came the rancher down the road who showed up one morning with hay stacked neatly at the end of Eleanor's fence. "Figured you might have deer," he said. He didn't mention bobcats. At the grocery store, a young teacher dropped a hand-knit scarf into Eleanor's basket. "My students heard about what you did," she whispered. "They've been drawing bobcats for art class." No one said the word sorry. Not yet. But kindness has a way of returning when you least expect it. Not loudly, but deliberately. Paul watched it unfold. He kept his distance. But he noticed the way people who once crossed the street to avoid Eleanor now paused, nodded, sometimes even smiled. It wasn't a tidal wave, but it was a thaw. And in a place like Townsend, Montana, where winters last long in the heart, that was no small thing. Still, not everyone approved. Everyone. At a town council meeting 2 weeks after the incident, the mayor made a veiled remark about civic responsibility and knowing our place in the ecosystem. A few heads nodded. One councilman called Eleanor's actions emotionally reckless. Paul had to choose his words carefully. But when they asked for public input, he stood up, adjusted his badge, and spoke plainly. "I've served this community for 5 years," he said. "I've responded to accidents, calls for help, even rescued hikers out in the back country. I've seen what neglect looks like. I've seen what harm feels like. This wasn't that." He paused. This was someone doing what most people wouldn't. She saw pain and stayed with it. She didn't panic. She didn't exploit it. She helped. A silence followed, the kind where nobody shifts in their seat. "I hope that if I'm ever injured on the side of the road," Paul continued, "someone like Eleanor Price finds me first." He sat back down. And though the vote didn't change anything official that night, something in the room had shifted. A stillness had broken. Later, outside, a young man from the sheriff's department caught up with him. "Was that smart?" he asked. "Going on the record like that?" Paul shrugged. "Might not be smart, but it's honest. You worried about your job." Paul thought about that for a moment. Thought about the faces of the people who had never stepped into that shed, never touched that trembling fur, never seen what a dying bobcat looks like when it decides to fight back. "I didn't take this job to enforce checklists," he said. "I took it to protect things worth protecting. Sometimes that means the ones who can't speak for themselves." The next morning, the Wildlife Board's response arrived in Eleanor's mailbox. Inside was a short note, based on community character references, veterinary testimony, and observable outcomes we are issuing. Ms. Eleanor Price, a provisional wildlife caregiver status under supervision and continued training. The bobcat in question, Tinker, is currently deemed non-releasable due to continued dependence and imprinting. We approve his monitored return into Eleanor's care under temporary sanctuary status. No legalese, no long list of conditions. Just a quiet yes. Eleanor called Paul that evening. "I don't know what you said in that letter," she began. Paul interrupted. "It wasn't what I said. It was what you did." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then a soft, "He's coming home." And he did. Wrapped in that same cedar blanket carried gently in a crate lined with pine needles, Tinker returned to the small house on Riverbend Lane. Not as a pet, not as a mascot, but as a life that had chosen to stay and been given permission to do so. Neighbors dropped by that afternoon bringing old towels, spare fencing, even an unused outdoor dog. Run. No one said much, but the quiet, warm gestures said everything. Paul visited later off duty without the uniform. He stood near the fence where Tinker now paced slowly, sniffing the snow-damp air. The bobcat was stronger now. Not wild, but not tame either. Something in between. Something rare. "He remembers you," Eleanor said. Paul watched as Tinker paused, turned, and fixed him with those amber eyes. He didn't blink, just stared. And then without a sound he sat. Animals remember. People do too. And sometimes the ones who stay, who don't walk away when things get messy, are the ones who change everything. Paul hadn't done anything extraordinary. He'd just stayed. When it was easier not to. When it was safer not to. That's what made the difference. Not the badge, not the report, just presence. There's a quiet kind of courage in that. A lesson for anyone who watches stories like these. It's not always about rushing to the rescue. Sometimes it's about choosing not to turn away, and sometimes that's enough to change the ending. When a whole town begins to thaw and kindness spreads one wild pore at a time. No one expected the bakery to be the place where things would begin to shift, but that's how change usually starts, in the quiet corners where no one's making speeches, just offering what they have. The first morning after Tinker returned, a loaf of warm molasses bread showed up on Eleanor's porch. Wrapped in a kitchen towel, still fragrant with cinnamon. No note, no name, just a simple offering left outside her door. She knew who it was from. Lucille Henderson hadn't spoken more than a few words to Eleanor in 20 years. They'd been friends once, girls who used to share apples in school and secrets by the river. But time, gossip, and grief had turned that closeness into something distant. After the fire that took Eleanor's father and nearly claimed Lucille's storefront, something in their relationship had broken and never been mended. Rumors had taken root, old pain hardened, but bread says what words count. Eleanor didn't eat it right away. She just stood by the window holding the warm bundle, letting the scent fill the room. In the yard beyond Tinker, padded along the edge of the enclosure, Paul and a few neighbors had helped set up a wide fenced area with natural logs, snow-soft corners, and space to move. He moved slowly, testing his strength, his wild cat instinct still half sleeping under his soft coat, but he was alert, present, healing. That same afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was Dennis from the feed store holding a weatherproof bin of hay. "Figured he might want to burrow," he said. "My dogs used to do that." He didn't wait for a thank you, just nodded once and left it by the gate. Eleanor blinked back a smile. That week, small gestures kept appearing. Blankets, a packet of dried sardines, a hand-drawn card from a second-grade class that simply said, "We love Tinker." "Thank you, Miss E." It had paw prints stamped in orange paint. Some of the people leaving gifts were strangers. Others were once critics. One woman, widow of the former mayor, dropped off a stack of cedar branches and said softly, "He's a wild one, but he deserves softness too." No one used the word redemption. No one said I was wrong. They just showed up. Paul noticed it too. Not just the gestures, but the way people began mentioning Eleanor differently. At the diner, someone described her as that lady with the bobcat, with curiosity, not contempt. A retired schoolteacher at church said, "Maybe I misjudged her. Takes guts to care like that." But not everyone changed overnight. At the next town hall meeting, a man stood up and said, We're setting a bad example. What if this encourages more people to interfere with wild animals? Paul let the silence hang for a second. Then he stood. No one's saying we ignore the law, he said calmly. But maybe we make space for grace inside it. He explained how the Wildlife Board had responded, how the provisional sanctuary had been approved, how Eleanor had followed every guideline since, how her actions had saved a life, not just the bobcats, but her own, too. She didn't do this for attention. She didn't post it online. She didn't try to turn it into a campaign. She just helped. A few people nodded. A few looked down. Eleanor never attended those meetings. She stayed home where it was quiet, where Tinker moved softly between shade and light, like a creature still remembering both. But she felt the towns shifting in small ways. One morning, a teenage boy knocked on her door. He looked nervous, hair too long for his face, holding a sketch pad. "Can I draw him?" he asked. "For my art class?" Eleanor smiled. "If you stay quiet." He sat by the fence for over an hour, said almost nothing. But before he left, he showed her the page. Tinker curled on a log alert, strong with eyes that watched. "It's beautiful," she said. "My brother had a raccoon once," he said, eyes down. "We didn't keep it long, but it helped him." Then he left without another word. That was the thing Eleanor kept noticing, people who shared their own quiet stories and animals. They'd rescued pets they'd lost, wild encounters that softened them. In one of the cards she received was a note from a woman named Marilyn, who wrote, "Watching your story reminded me of my dog, Pepper. I never got to say goodbye. Thank you for helping something wild stay alive." It brought me back to something I'd lost. These weren't just kind messages. They were echoes of healing. And the lesson was simple. When one person chooses to care out loud, it gives others permission to remember they can too. Animal rescue emotional stories have a way of opening doors that had been long shut doors, into compassion, into old wounds, into places we've quietly forgotten. A wild cat baby might not seem like much to a world scrolling by in a hurry, but to someone watching, it's a moment of pause, a reminder. That connection still matters. That love doesn't always follow logic. That sometimes the things we call wild are simply waiting for someone to stay long enough to understand them. In Townsend, Montana, where winters are long and words are often short, that kind of reminder was rare. But it was happening. And not just because of Eleanor, because of Paul, who kept showing up, because of Dr. Mendez, who volunteered to do follow-ups without charging a fee, because of the children drawing bobcats and asking their teachers why animals lose their homes. It became more than a story. It became a reflection. The town was beginning to see that a baby bobcat wasn't just a wild animal. He was a symbol of the kindness they thought they'd lost, of the second chances they didn't know they needed, of what can grow when someone chooses to listen. And Tinker, he kept healing, quietly, slowly, but steadily. He learned to climb again, to stretch, to sleep deeply without flinching. He was never a pet, never tame, but he was no longer afraid, and neither, perhaps, was Eleanor. Sometimes a town doesn't change through votes or announcements. Sometimes it shifts because someone stopped long enough to offer bread, to draw a picture, to leave a paw print where a wall used to be. One life carried through the snow had become a bridge. And as spring approached, something new was blooming beneath the thaw. It happened just after midnight, on a night when the sky had gone dark too early, and the wind howled like it was warning something. In Townsend, most folks had turned off their porch lights, drawn the curtains, and left the cold to its own business. But Eleanor hadn't gone to bed. She rarely did before 1 a.m. these days. She'd been restless all evening, no reason she could name. Just a feeling, a strange weight in the air. Some people call it instinct, others might call it memory. Whatever it was, she kept the kettle warm and her boots by the door. Tinker had paced more than usual that day. Not panicked, not agitated, just alert. His movements around the enclosure had a purpose to them, like he was listening for something beyond the fence line. When Eleanor asked, "What is it, boy?" He'd just flicked his ears once and continued his silent patrol. By midnight, the wind had picked up hard. It wasn't a steady wind. It came in bursts, snatching at the shutters, rattling the gate, rushing through the cracks with a sound that made the house feel suddenly older. And then somewhere around 12:40, the power went out. Eleanor, moving by lantern light, made her way to the front door to check on the wood pile. That's when it happened. A patch of ice beneath the snow. A misplaced step, a soft cry muffled by the wind. She fell, not hard, but wrong. Her knee twisted beneath her, and her ribs struck the edge of the porch stair. She lay still for a moment, stunned by the cold, the sharp jolt of breathlessness. Then pain, radiating across her side. She couldn't move, not properly, not enough to stand, and the wind just kept coming. Inside the enclosure, Tinker had gone still. He lifted his head, turned it, then moved to the gate. He watched, for maybe 3 seconds. Then, like something ancient woke up inside him, he acted. With a leap, he cleared the low section of the fence, a place Paul had reinforced but not raised, thinking the bobcat's injuries still limited his strength. Tinker moved through the yard like he'd done it 100 times. Quiet, sure, a ghost with purpose. Eleanor had managed to lift her head once, just enough to see the silhouette of movement through the snow. Her breath came in sharp puffs. "Tinker," she whispered, "go back." But he didn't. Instead, he approached, slowly, not like a cat, not like a pet, but like something older, wiser. He crouched beside her, nuzzling her coat. Then when she didn't move, he sat beside her, guarded her, tail curled neatly, ears flicking against the wind. Minutes passed, maybe more, and then suddenly he turned his head and darted toward the road. Officer Paul was halfway across town, returning from a welfare check, when his cruiser's high beams caught movement on the shoulder. A bobcat, not running away, but running toward the vehicle. He slowed, blinked, and opened the door. Tinker stopped a few feet away and turned sharply, sprinting back in the direction he came. Something clicked in Paul's gut. He followed. 10 minutes later, flashlight in hand, Paul found Eleanor, half-conscious, pale, curled beside the porch in a patch of trampled snow. The wind had eased, but the cold had not. Tinker was sitting near her, unmoving, watching. Paul dropped to his knees. "Eleanor," she stirred. He didn't leave me." "No," Paul said softly. He didn't. The ambulance arrived quickly. Mild hypothermia, bruised ribs, sprained knee. Nothing broken, nothing too far gone, but just enough to have turned worse if not for a creature most people still called wild. At the clinic, as Paul waited outside her room, one of the EMTs asked, "Was that really a bobcat, I mean, not a dog?" Paul smiled. "Yeah, a bobcat." Back home, Tinker was returned gently to his enclosure. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He just paced a few times, then curled into the straw, blinking slowly like someone who had done their part. In the following days, word spread. Not sensationally. Not through headlines or breaking news. Just person to person. Neighbor to neighbor. Someone at the pharmacy told the postmaster. The librarian heard it from a nurse. Children at school began drawing bobcats again, this time with capes. But no one called Tinker a hero. They called him something quieter, loyal, present, a friend. And in those words, something beautiful bloomed. Because wild animal rescue stories often focus on what we do for them. The cages we build, the medicine we provide, the way we speak in soft tones. But what about when they give something back? What about when they remember the hands that carried them through pain? What about when a wild cat baby chooses not to disappear into the trees, but to circle back, stand guard, and cry out into the night until help comes? That's not just instinct, that's connection, and sometimes that's love in its purest, most surprising form. Later, Eleanor joked with Paul. "He's earned his own blanket now. Paul chuckled. He's earned a statue. But they didn't give him a monument, just a cedar tag at the edge of his enclosure, hand-painted by local school kids. It read, "He watched. He waited. He stayed." And under it, 3 paw prints pressed into cement. Not captured, just remembered. There's a quiet lesson here, one that applies beyond animals, beyond towns like Townsend. The things we carry with care often find a way to carry us back. Not because they have to, but because something in them remembers the warmth, the safety, the feeling of not being alone in the cold. It's the same reason people tune in to animal rescue emotional videos night after night. Not just to watch a transformation, but to feel something restored inside themselves. Hope, loyalty, faith in small miracles. And for Eleanor, none of this was about proving anything. It was just about staying long enough to matter. Tinker had shown her that she still could, and when the time came to let go, she'd already know what that meant. Spring came slow that year. Townsend thawed in pieces, ribbons of mud winding down gravel roads, snow curling into mist at the edge of fences. It was the kind of spring you had to lean in to notice. Nothing bloomed all at once, but you could feel it coming, and in Eleanor's yard, it came with silence. Tinker had stopped pacing the fence 2 weeks earlier. He spent longer hours stretched out under the spruce tree, blinking at birds, lifting his nose towards smells drifting down from the hills. When she called his name now, he looked not out of confusion, but out of courtesy. Something in him had changed. He'd healed, fully, and he was ready. She knew it the way you know when a grown child doesn't need your help tying their shoes anymore. Not because they said so, but because they stood taller. The sanctuary permit had always been provisional. The Wildlife Board had made that clear temporary care under evaluation for release. No guarantees. But everyone had seen the signs. Dr. Mendez visited with her clipboard. Quiet nods. Careful exams. He could go, she said. There's no more limp. He's hunting instinctively. He avoids eye contact with strangers. That's what we look for in a bobcat ready for rewilding. Eleanor didn't argue, just nodded her hand, resting gently on the gate latch. And so the date was set. One morning in May, just after sunrise, Paul pulled into the driveway with his truck. The preserve team from the Bitterroot Mountains was already there, setting up a quiet holding crate lined with pine and straw. Tinker watched from his usual corner. Calm, not afraid, just alert. Eleanor approached him slowly, crouched nearby. She didn't bring treats, didn't call out. She just sat, the same way she had the day she found him in her shed, offering stillness, not ownership. He walked to her once, touched his nose to her sleeve, then turned and stepped into the open crate. No fight, no hesitation, just trust. The drive to the drop-off site took 4 hours. Paul rode behind the team. Eleanor came too by quiet request. She didn't speak much, just looked out the window, her fingers resting lightly on a cedar-stitched cloth folded in her lap. At the base of a high trail surrounded by dense forest and no signs of people, they opened the door. Tinker stepped out. For a second, he paused. His tail flicked once. He looked back, not with confusion, but with acknowledgement. Then he disappeared into the trees without a sound. Eleanor stood still for a long time. He didn't even look back, someone said softly. But she heard it differently. He didn't need to. Because the greatest kind of love isn't the kind that keeps. It's the kind that releases. The kind that carries someone only as long as they can't carry themselves and then lets go with grace. That was her gift to him, and his gift to her. The quiet reminder that she still mattered, that even late in life she could be needed, trusted, loved by something pure and wild. Tinker was never seen again, not officially. But sometimes in late summer, hikers near the ridge would report hearing something unusual, a low, hot cry. Not quite a yowl, not quite a growl. And once a park ranger found a log marked with faint, precise claw scratches, too fine for a cougar, too fresh to be weathered. Eleanor didn't ask for reports. But when Paul stopped by, he'd mention one now and then. Could be him, he'd say. She'd smile. Could be, and that was enough. Back in town, her yard grew into something new. The enclosure was taken down, but the space remained wildflowers planted where paw prints used to be. Children still stopped by to bring drawings. Neighbors waved more often now. A girl once left a handmade sign on the gate. "Thank you for loving the wild things." Eleanor kept Tinker's blanket in a cedar chest, not because she needed it, but because she liked knowing it was there. Because healing doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means carrying forward. Stories like these stay with us, not because of spectacle, but because of softness, because they remind us that something as small as a bobcat baby spotted, frightened, nearly frozen in the snow can ripple through a town, a life, a heart, and change everything. They remind us of the quiet people, the ones who knit kindness into every small decision. The ones who don't seek attention but offer care when no one else will. They remind us that wild animal rescue is not just about biology. It's about belief, about choosing to see value in something others overlook, about walking slowly toward pain, not away from it. In a world that often moves too fast, where empathy is sometimes drowned out by noise, stories like Tinker's feel like a pause, a breath, a reminder that our hearts still respond to gentle things. Maybe that's why you're still here, watching, listening, because somewhere deep down you believe in these stories too. Maybe you've carried something heavy, or let something go, or wondered if your small act of care made a difference. Let me tell you it did, because someone like Eleanor never knew her choice would reach beyond a fence line. But it did, just like yours can. If this story touched something in you, take a moment and leave a comment below. Tell us what you're carrying, or what you've let go of, or who once stayed for you. And if you believe in second chances for people, for animals, for broken things, once wild, share this story. Because sometimes the world just needs to be reminded that kindness still matters. And somewhere out there, deep in the trees, a wild creature may still pause for just a second and remember the hand that helped him heal. If this story moved you, wait until you hear about the mountain fox who found her way back to the woman who saved her across 5 winters. When the phone call came, Eleanor had just finished folding the last of the winter blankets. It was late April, the time of year when Montana gives no guarantees. Some days still arrived with frost clinging to the fence posts. Others carried the sharp promise of warmth. That morning, the sun had pushed through just long enough to dry the back porch steps. The call was short. A wildlife specialist from the preserve Tinker had been transferred to. Calm voice, respectful tone. "He's healthy, strong, fully independent. We believe it's time." Eleanor didn't ask what time meant. She already knew. Release. Not a public event. No cameras, no ribbons. Just a gate opened in the right place at the right hour to let something return to what it always was, wild, free, whole. She said thank you, hung up the phone, and stood still in the kitchen for a long time. It's a strange kind of love, the one that prepares itself for goodbye from the first moment you say hello. But that's the kind of love people rarely talk about. The kind that holds something for a little while, knowing it was never meant to stay. Tinker had always belonged to the wild. That part was never in question. The baby bobcat she had wrapped in a cedar-scented blanket wasn't hers to keep, only to carry through the storm. And she had. His release wasn't a ceremony. No witnesses aside from the trees, the sky, and the hands that opened the crate. The wildlife team reported that he stepped out, slowly sniffed the air, and vanished into the brush without turning back. Exactly as they hoped. No signs of imprinting. No lingering dependence. Just instinct doing its quiet work. For them, it was a success story. For Eleanor, it was something more. Because behind every successful animal rescue is a human story. A quiet thread of connection we're not always brave enough to name. For Eleanor, that thread began in her shed on a night of deep snow and ended with a silent departure on thawing ground. It would be easy to say she felt sadness, but what she actually felt was something quieter and maybe more sacred. Completion, Letting go isn't failure. It's not loss, it's recognition. It's choosing to say, I was here for your beginning. I don't need to be there for your middle or your end. And that's okay. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor found herself settling into new rhythms. She walked to the edge of the woods some evenings, not to look for paw prints, she knew they wouldn't be there, but to listen. Sometimes a breeze would pass that smelled faintly of pine and something wilder. Sometimes she smiled and turned back home. The enclosure where Tinker once slept remained empty. Grass began to reclaim it. Children from the local school still dropped off drawings, but they now featured more than just Tinker. They drew birds, deer, trees. One child drew Eleanor herself, holding a fox in one arm and a butterfly in the other. Love like that, quiet, rippling through a community, has weight. And it lasts, but Eleanor never sought recognition. She didn't think of herself as someone who had changed a town or reminded people of what gentle action looks like. She had only ever done what felt human, and in doing so, she reminded others that being human doesn't end when you age or grieve or live alone at the edge of town. It expands. That's what wild animals can teach us, especially rescue animals. We think we're saving them, but often they're showing us parts of ourselves we've forgotten how to see. Patience, trust, presence, a softness that isn't weakness. Tinker for Eleanor was never a project. He was a companion in the quiet, a bridge back to the part of her that believed she still had something to give. And that's what makes this story unforgettable. Not just the image of a baby bobcat carried through the snow, or the moment he stayed by her side when she couldn't rise. It's the truth at the heart of it, that healing goes both ways. That wild animals and humans can meet somewhere in the middle, not as owner and pet, not even as rescuer and rescued, but as beings who in the right moment simply choose not to walk away. That sometimes the most profound acts of love don't come from holding tighter. They come from releasing with care. And maybe that's something we need to remember now more than ever. In a world moving fast, where everyone's chasing something or running from something, stories like this slow us down. They bring us back to the quiet courage of one woman, a wildcat baby, and the space they created for each other to breathe. It's easy to scroll past a cute animal video. Easy to like a story about a bobcat and never think about it again. But maybe, if you let it, this one stays with you. Because maybe you've been in Eleanor's shoes. Maybe you've carried something fragile through a storm. Maybe you've stood at the edge of a goodbye, unsure if letting go was the right choice. And maybe deep down you've wondered whether any of it mattered. It did, and it does. Because every act of care, no matter how small, reshapes the world in some way. Every time someone chooses kindness over convenience. Every time someone stays even when they have every reason to leave. Every time someone helps a creature or a person who can't give them anything back. Something good takes root. And sometimes that's enough to shift an entire town. Or an entire heart. So maybe now is the right moment for you to ask yourself, what am I holding that needs releasing? What silent bond have I formed with a person, a memory, a dream that has already done its work? And if letting go is the next step, can I do it not with grief, but with gratitude? Because Eleanor did. And because Tinker, soft-footed, sharp-eyed, wild-hearted, showed us that sometimes leaving is the final way we say thank you. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to breathe. Reflect on what you've been carrying. Then if you're ready, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what this story awakened in you. And if you believe that compassion toward animals, toward people, toward yourself still matters. In this world, click like and subscribe to join this journey. There are more stories ahead, and maybe, just maybe, one of them is yours.